Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Akram Khatir. I'm a professor in Middle Eastern History at North Carolina State University. I'm also the director of the Moise Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at NC State. Today, we are privileged to be speaking with Dr. Rula Jurdi, the author of the novel في علبة الضوء. Dr. Ajurdi is a co-winner of the 2020 Khayrallah Prize, and today we'll be talking to her about her novel, about her literary and scholarly career, and about her childhood in Lebanon.
I just want to take a few minutes to thank you all. I was really moved by the decision of the committee, especially knowing the caliber of the people on this committee and their depth. I also know you scholarly wise from different capacities. I've read your work, so that in itself meant a lot to me. So I want to thank you so much. I'm really honored. I am Rula Jurdi. I was born in Venezuela. So my parents, so you can call me probably in some ways double immigrant, even though I did not grow up in Venezuela. So my parents, my father went to Venezuela because his uncle went there and they started, those business, the Lebanese are good merchants, at least that's the reputation. And so they started at first a zapateria, which is, a shop for shoes. And I have fond memories of what my dad told me about that store. And then they moved to something else. And then my father founded an industry for kitchen cabinets in the eastern side of Venezuela. But all of this happened while I was in Lebanon. I returned to Lebanon when I was 3 years old. So I did not grow up really in Venezuela. And so my dad just visited us. My mom was in Lebanon. My dad was adamant about us going back to Lebanon. So the minute, he realized, we're starting to speak Spanish and just feel Venezuelan, he just, said, you should go. We have to have the sacrifice. You take the kids, go and I will visit you. And that's how it happened for 25 to 30 years. My dad kind of commuted between Venezuela and Lebanon. And so at home, the family, the second language was Spanish, kind of they spoke Spanish. And my dad always had this thing for French. So, I mean, it was very complex. So he had this thing about, he would have liked to send us to French school so we could speak French, except that I'm grateful that in a way he didn't, because the school I went to was absolutely wonderful. It was in Shuaifat, Charles Saad, and his father, the father of Charles Saad was qassis, so he was a reverend, and he studied in the UK. And so some of the teachers we had came from Britain, but we never, at Charles Saad, you never lose your Arabic language. In fact, it is very much reinforced. And in addition to that, you have English. I mean, in a way that probably I wouldn't have been able to do probably at the French schools, where it was much more, the emphasis on speaking the French would have probably overwhelmed the Arabic to some extent, at least from what, let's say, Itil Adnan's, some of the people who actually studied there would tell you. So that's how I grew up in a town. Shuaifat was really a small town, and I considered myself to have come from a small town. When I started going down to Beirut, I realized that I was really from a small town. Because I just was a bit overwhelmed by Beirut. I was, startled by Beirut, fell in love with it, but really kind of overwhelmed by the shift, especially also, my parents, my father is very conservative. So I did not really move a lot. I was not one of those, students at school who would go to a party, where they would invite you to. My dad, like, what is a party? Like, tell me what, what are you gonna do at a party, right? So he came from that background, very, very strict. And I had a lot of time on my hands, so I was reading a lot. So I kind of read like probably by the age of 15, I've read everything my mom had bought my dad in the house. Uh, Again, it's not really whether you have the inclination or not. It's also the style of life, as I've told you, the conservatism that, girls do not visit. They do not have parties. They don't, I mean, like if you go with your family. So this is the life that I lived. And the books were my door to that other fun world that I felt restricted from having in a way.
So let's talk a little bit about those books because they appear to be your first foray outside the boundaries of Shwayfet into a larger world. So I'm kind of curious about the kind of books that your mom would have purchased that were available to you,
Right.
the authors, and the kind of the horizons that they opened for you.
Yeah. Do you know that name? It's very old. These are old, simple love stories by the Lebanese author Pierre Rufail. They're old. I mean, it's a name that I know it's not gonna ring a bell. But my mom read some of that. She also read things that are medical, like medical journals. She liked stuff like that. And we had also Maroon Aboud, Jubran, Mikhail Naimi. I mean, these were Tawfiq Yusuf Awad. So these works were there, and we read them. Anis Freiha, and beyond that, the Egyptian authors. So my mom read a lot for the Hassan Abdul Quddus, and then later Najib Mahfoud. And when the family got bigger and bigger, I think that she was not able to continue reading. But I remember that she read when we were 3. When we became 6, it was like I didn't see her able to do that. She came from a family that was very conscious of good writing. And that is the Taqiyuddin family. Saeed Taqiyuddin and Khalil Taqiyuddin, who wrote Tamara, he was a ambassador. And so she kind of grew up with this sense that you have to, say Arabic so the idiomatic expressions in Arabic that came from Aqlin, from her own town, were really lovely, very rich. And so my mom, when she answered, early on, I realized when she answers with these kinds of proverbs, these local proverbs. That's how she taught me things. And my dad too. My dad was very, very conscious of the Arabic language. And let's say when I passed, like when I took my back one, my high school, he would write a poem for me. So he loved to compose poetry. So definitely I grew up with my mom and dad being correcting us how we speak, things like that. But I am talking also about the local Lebanese, the local Lebanese, the richness of the local Lebanese in the Shuf area, and in the area that my dad lived in. Shweifat had many, many schools. There was Shal Saad, there was Trad, there was Afifi Saab had also, so there were a number of different experiences, and he had an experience in a couple of these. So it was interesting, that these are the kinds of early books I read. And then later on, the ones that I bought, I read a lot of, I read Russian and British novels. And I read things early on. I read them in translation, so in Arabic, and then I read them in English. And then, of course, I read Hanan al-Sheikh. I really loved her early novels a lot. And I read Najib Mahfoud. I was really kind of, for a while, I could felt that I could only read that. But it's very different. I mean, it has a very different feel to it than Hanan al-Sheikh. Hanan al-Sheikh, I think, was, spoke to me directly due to the gendered elements in it. That was very prominent. And it was, my dad read Ghada Saman. It didn't grow on me that much, Ghada Saman. I probably read for Colette Khouri. I read these other Hannamina. But definitely, I think Hanan al-Sheikh, her Hikayat Zahra was kind of a milestone, let's say, in looking at, oh, look at what this person is writing and look how she's presenting it. And yeah, I thought that was an amazingly kind of brave type of a novel. Yeah.
So you clearly grew up in this incredibly rich environment, literary and linguistically rich environment, both that was set up by your mom, but also your father as well. And of course, that is being fed by, as you said, the Lebanese local dialect from Ba'alin, Shwaife. Earlier, you said that for you, Beirut was a shock to a certain extent. And yet a lot of these novelists that you're talking about are taking the city as the locus of their work. Hanan al-Sheikh, of course, in the Hikayat Zahra is talking about Beirut in many ways, and as well as Jnub, the south of Lebanon. So I'm kind of curious as at what point do you then start engaging the city as a place of this cultural, because Beirut was known, and I'm assuming here we're talking about 60s and 70s that you're going to school, right? I mean, that's a time period?
Right. It's yes, for Beirut. I mean, basically the 70s.
I mean, you and I basically were beginning to understand Beirut in our teenage years around the 70s before the Civil War, and I'm going to come back to the Civil War in a bit. But so when do you start discovering the city as, you know, as a city? I mean, as this cultural center that a lot of the Arab world is beginning to notice, and you know, a lot of writers in exile are living in it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just fell in love with that space. I mean, first of all, initially, it's a space for me to breathe from the close ties of the town, and the family ties. I lived in very closely knit family ties that was suffocating, and I was very aware that it was suffocating, and it was painful. It was like painful. But I think my attachment to Beirut again comes from my mother. My mother lived in Beirut, even though her family originally was from Ain Dara and then Aqlin. Really, she is a Beiruti. She grew up in Snubra, and so the contrast for me is that my mother went to the cinema. My mother went to listen to these concerts as a young woman, and on my father's family, none of that kind of was permissible in a way. So that comes to me very clearly. My mother's love for Beirut, attachment to that world that she felt she lost. She was confined. She was quite confined in the marriage with my father, and with me also as a young woman, it was painful. It was just suffocating. So I think I embraced that. The first thing that I embraced in Beirut is that aspect where you are, you know, you don't have any member of your family there. You can be. And you can be and you can feel, and then you can let yourself just be who you are. And but then I developed ties. Then the friendships came, and I had very deep friendships with a number of people living in, let's say, Al Makhul. So because during the 80s, so 1983 and after, I lived in Beirut. So I lived for 2 years in Beirut, in Al Hamra. And then, you know, and then my attachment to Beirut, as you can imagine, became much more profound and almost, I mean, I feel that it will always be my first city. I mean, my attachment to Beirut is so deep that, you know, the explosion in that happened in El Marfa, it was devastating for me. So yeah, it's so I think living there and developing friendships, like real deep friendships, made it real. It was no longer just an icon. I'm living in it. I'm making my own space within it. So that's how.
So what took you to Beirut itself? Is that the time when you enrolled at the American University in Beirut? Is that?
Yes. Yes, it was first when I enrolled, and then I left to complete my MA in California. And then I went back to teach at Beirut, and I stayed for 2 years there before I did my PhD. So I kind of took a break between the MA and the PhD and lived there. So I had lived, so intermittently, all in all, probably I've lived 3 to 4 years in Beirut. Yeah.
And what made you decide to go to AUB, and what did you study at AUB, both as an undergraduate and then later on when you did your master's?
Yes, I did. I did my BA in anthropology, and then I did an MA in anthropology, and then I did another MA in Middle Eastern studies, and then my PhD in history. In Islamic history. So that's how I did it. Yeah, I took 2 MAs.
So, but I mean, obviously there was Lebanese University. I mean, your English background, so that obviously you can't go to the Saint Joseph University.
Right.
It's a French-speaking university.
Right. Right.
But there's LAU at that point, and there's
right.
What is it about AUB?
I think that it's because it was a tradition that in my family they would go to the AUB. Probably more than anything, it was like that. And maybe they felt that it was prestigious, and they had family there, so it's not, it's not an alien space. That's another thing, because I had my eldest cousin there, and and they thought that way, because you had to have someone, there. You're young, and you need someone kind of to, keep an eye on you. Yeah, definitely that was a consideration. Yeah. Definitely.
So from your undergraduate years, before you go to California to teach and then come back to do your master's, what are some of the formative experiences that you can recall, both as an intellectual, as a person, and of course, as a writer? I mean, are you at this point beginning to experiment with your writing? Is it something that you're doing? Or what are some of the things that sort of are feeding your creativity as well as your scholarship?
Yeah, I had stopped so basically I started out writing poetry. I never thought that I would write novels. And for 12 to 15 years, I stopped writing for many reasons. Probably partly because of the stress of pursuing an academic degree. And then when my sister died, when she died after a long struggle with cancer, I started writing nonstop. So I started writing my poetry. So I have 3 collections of poetry. One of them is gonna come out very soon. And when I wrote this novel, I never thought that I would write this novel. It was something that was urgent in the sense that I felt it lurking there, that I needed to develop these ideas, weave them together, and they started to evolve in a very intense way. So again, I feel that this novel was written, I was writing it and saying, why am I writing a novel? I'm a poet. I never thought I would write a novel. So even as I was writing it, I was kind of doubting whether this should be the medium for me. And I had written a novel earlier that in terms of technique, it was not that developed. So it was about the war. And I think the ideas, when I look back at it, I say, okay, I like the ideas, but I don't like the writing. I feel that my writing at that time really was not that developed. So in a way, this is really like my first novel, this one. And the creativity, I don't know. I really don't know what it is, honestly, because when people ask me which author had shaped your writing, I do not have an answer because I don't know. I know that I love the writing of Garcia Marquez. I love the way Hanan al-Sheikh wrote, Najib Mahfoud. I love Maroon Aboud's, the small village kind of, the way he looks at the small village and the sense of humor. That I love. So who knows whether these precipitated in many, many different ways to create this. But I had to really work on not writing a poem, a novel as a poem. There was a lot of pressure. But my first novel, I think why the technique didn't work is that it was like being written as kind of these these moments of reflection that look like poetry. And it didn't work completely. I mean, there's a way in which poetry, a novel could work as poetry if you develop the format, if you develop the framework and how you do it. So now I feel, yes, I am experimenting much more. I have another novel coming out called Mi'atu Rasha from Al-Adab. And it really talks about Salafism and the experiences of Salafism and music. And specifically, I mean, music is a very important theme. And I feel that it developed, the one that I'm finishing right now is very different stylistically. I'm much more comfortable with myself. I don't have to worry about whether the flow, the temporality of the novel, or even the links between past and present are direct or indirect. I feel that they are working in a way. But yes, there is more experimentation, I guess. But the creativity, I don't know. I really don't know. It's difficult to tell.
So I want to come back to the novel in a bit because I really want to explore the novel at a greater length, obviously, given that the novel is really what you have received the Khayrallah Prize for this year.
Yeah.
But you said that there's a period of 10 to 15 years when you were doing your academic work, scholarly work, and you're Islamic studies scholar, as many people know.
Yes.
And you have written extensively about Iran, the Safavid period,
Yes.
but also about a variety of theological issues and so on and so forth. So the notion was that there was this moment in which there was a personal trauma with the death of your sister. So the question is two parts. First of all, had you ever played around with literature before that, or was that the moment that you sort of launched, in essence, your literary self? And why do you think that is?
I had published for a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years. I published at the school's journal, my poems. I published at other places also when I was in California. And I wrote a little bit in English because I also write poetry in English. And then I had written, so I had written poetry and I had published my poetry, but it is really after my sister, but I stopped for 12 to 15 years. I stopped. It could be the academia, it could be the sense of alienation I had by the way, there is, poetry is such an alienating process, because people do not respond. Uh, you do not have that immediate reward when you are reading a poem. Very few people are going to kind of respond to you at the level that you have actually written this. It takes time to settle, to think about it, especially since a lot of my poems do have, the surrealism. So the surreal is very important in my poetry. It's not a direct kind of poem that people can immediately link to. So it's very alienating, and maybe that type of an alienation became overwhelming that I stopped. Or I suppressed it, of course. I don't think that you can stop. It was suppressed. And then when my sister passed away, this was my way of just expressing all of the things that cannot be expressed. I mean, poetry is a very important medium for expressing things that you just cannot say in normal language. And then after that, I wrote my first novel, which, as I've told you, the writing was not that developed. I wanted her to read it, but she passed away before it came out. I had dedicated it to her. So yeah, I think these personal links and personal tragedies do play an important role in creative writing, in ways that may not be traceable in academic work and academic writing.
So before we shift to the novel and talking about its genesis and what you know, how you see the novel, what in essence story you're telling in the novel. I'm kind of curious if in your own writing you do see a link between your scholarship and the creative writing part of you. Are they feeding each other at all, or do you feel like in some ways you want to keep them isolated because you don't want uh, academies or academic thinking to overwhelm the creative, or vice versa?
You know, that's a great question. I think when we are teaching, when I'm teaching, let's say, about certain concepts, usually you assume the position, especially when you're teaching, not maybe when you're writing. When you're writing, you give yourself, you know, a more assertive position on different points. But when you're teaching, sometimes you are caught in trying to make the students not take positions, strong positions with or against, let's say, an Islamic value or Islamic belief. Because I teach Islam, I can talk about Islam. But then there is that moment of contradiction where you know that you have a position. You know that actually you're asking them to be open-minded about things about which you are very subjective and you actually have a very strong biases. I mean, we can call them biases, we can call them strong positions, but that dilemma really bothers me, because the voice that you assume as a teacher is to open things and, okay, let's have all opinions, please don't shut the other person out. And that becomes, to me, a burden. And the writing is actually to show my doubts, my skepticism about all of these things that, you know, and even, you know, and I can be very honest, I'm very contradictory. And even some of the things that I wrote about, I could very much at a later period be skeptical about. And I have been, and I have been. You know, to me, what happened in Syria I will never be the same teacher or the same scholar after Daesh. You know what, after you know, the persecution of Copts in Egypt. So what I wanted to say is that sometimes we entertain certain ideas, right, that are part of the Islamic tradition, and I wanted, you know, to open up the students to discursive possibilities, except that I am part of that world. I'm in that society. I live in that society, and no, you know, I grew skeptical of some of the things that I used to teach. Yeah, I used to teach, definitely. So,
I have to tell you, I really appreciate your intellectual honesty and courage to say that, because very few of us would admit some of these things. And I think it's I mean, I think we are all in some ways intellectually organic, and we're developing and we see things that test us. So I really appreciate that you said that. That actually is very profound to me
I
as
mean,
well. You said that.
it's being very, very honest. You know, it's really being honest that I worked through that skepticism. I think the novels and the poetry are filled with skepticism. my scholarship my scholarship, you know, appears to be filled with certainty. You know, it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma.
It is absolutely a dilemma, but I mean, I have to say that that honesty is part of the power of the novel. So I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about the novel itself. So let's just talk basic stuff first. When did you start writing the novel, and what prompted you to write on this subject?
Yes. So the novel appeared. So the novel appeared 2017 or 18, something like that. So I started writing it around 2015, 2016, around that time. And what prompted me is my the great aunt of my mother was a Sufi, a woman. I mean, Sufi in the Irfani Druze sense of the term. And she had a khalwa, so she had a prayer place. And when we used to go to my mother's family and stay with her aunt, you know, her other great aunt is just like within spitting distance of our house. So she was always there with all of these women going to pray. So I knew about that. I was never part of that. Even my mom, you know, she didn't like participate, but but her direct aunt did. And so that world kind of opened to me through that. But I remembered that all of these women passed away. And my mother passed away. And maybe the passing of my mother, I started remembering these things that her great aunt said and her aunt said. And I realized something very interesting. I realized that their type of religiosity was unique. It's not like what is usually associated with the more puritanical approach of the other Druze, religious men, especially the men. I felt that I was never taught anything that was bigoted by this woman, who was kind of her student, the student of let's say, Sarah, the one that I called Sarah, and my mother's great aunt was called Saada. And so I realized that there's a world there that disappeared. Something has happened, there's a shift, because there is so much hatred in a lot of the religious teachings, universally, it seems, universally, even across religious lines. But that there was that moment where, my aunt always understood this difference between being a practitioner in one tradition and actually being a real Sufi, which means that you belong to all religious traditions, the idea of unification. And so I wanted to write about that. And I called a relative of mine in California, also an immigrant, and said, is there something about her life that was collected together? She said, yeah, her cousin, her nephew wrote something about it locally in the library in Berlin. And I wasn't able to go. So then I went in the summer. I started writing. I just started writing what I felt and wanted to say. But I also wanted to so I wanted this image of the Sufi woman to be juxtaposed against someone who's a skeptic, who's a modern skeptic, who doesn't believe that. And the only way that they can meet is by the moral conduct of that woman. That the only way that she can be convinced by that, by the Sufi woman, is her ethical, universal kind of humanism that was embedded really in her religious practice, unlike all of the others. And I also know from experience, a lot of Druze will tell you that there is something there among the Druze, an attraction to Christianity. And the reason being that you have the religious practitioners, the Ajawid, and then you have those who call themselves secular. I don't know whether they're secular, but let's say that they are not practitioners. Now, there's a void among them, because if you do not actually declare that you want to join the group of the Ajawid, the practitioners, then you really have nothing except those visitations to saints' tombs. You are not reading in any book. There's a void. So that spiritual void gets to be filled, at least, in the parts where Christians and Druze live together. It gets to be filled with beliefs in Ma Sherbel or Iddisi Raf'a, and you see that, but you're not going to see it directly. You're going to see it when you go to someone's house, and in the corner there, they will have something from Ma Sherbel and the Christian saints. And it is because of that void, because they don't have any teachings unless they become practitioners, that they turn to Christianity, and also because Christianity is very attractive to them, because they do believe in, in Christianity, many Christians believe that Jesus is God, right? This idea also exists among the Druze, that their imam was actually an incarnation, like he was God. He was God, which is considered to be, of course, heretical in Islam. So there is this subtle attraction and complexity of this attraction in the middle of fierce political fighting. And it was, to me, like mind-boggling Like, they also want to send their children to Catholic schools. They will tell you that they will say, no, 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 we will send them to Catholic, because then they will learn adab, and they will learn good manners, and then they will be chaste, the girls, stuff like that. So there's this very complex, very difficult relationship, with the Christians during the Civil War. And I wanted these women, to represent the voice of this universal humanism, this kind of religion that transcends all lines and all religions, even back to paganism, from the Egyptian period to the Hellenistic period, because this line exists in their books. These links exist in their books. So there's a way. There should be an easy way, actually, to reach this kind of universal humanism, I thought. And I bring that universal humanism to stand in the face of brutality and massacres and sectarian massacres, as a way to be, and also to disclose, to be open about our own, our own bestialities. I mean, we have to be open. I think it's just, there's no other way. But to name things by their name. So to me, it was also very cathartic to write this novel. Yeah.
It's a very moving description of what you just said about universal humanism. And certainly it's a theme that plays out from the beginning and literally to the end of the book. At the same time, though, it's really interesting because you're looking at two types of eyes of seeing, ways of seeing. One, of course, is the Sufi eye that is transcendental and goes beyond the physicality around them to see something of God in every one of us, hence universal humanism. And then there's a camera, another way of capturing sight of sort, of being able to see, and sort of another heroine, or perhaps she's the anti-heroine, or she's the foil for Sarah, is this young, vivacious, full of life young woman who just wants to pick up a camera and kick down every gender boundary, and then ends up in New York making films and experiencing films about imperialism, about violence, about the human unfortunate condition. And then she marries outside the boundaries of the community, outside the Druze community, and comes back to create a scandalous moment that Sarah tries to diffuse, even though she is upset with her. So there are these two characters that are, together, then they depart, then she comes back, kind of a migratory journey, both physical as well as intellectual, but more importantly, kind of epistemological. I mean, there are different ways of being.
Right.
So I'm kind of curious why these two, what the second character, from your point of view, was supposed to be doing in this novel.
It was supposed to probe into what is taken as a given, because Sarah still believed in preserving the community's probably internal marriages. She was not going to simply accept, based on her own teachings, that someone would go and just marry a non-Druze, because she thinks that there is a whole tradition. So her type of humanism really is embedded in the Sufi tradition, and it is not a liberal one. It is not a modern liberal one. And so this was not good enough for Noor. Noor, who took the camera, was really split between two worlds, because she left Dar Shams. She went to another place. You move to another place. You move also through other times. And when she is in New York, she realizes that even that world needs to still be expanded. The boundaries of these worlds still need to be expanded without losing who you are. I think that this is a personality that wants to show that it's anchored in the place she came from. She's not floating to find herself. She's anchored, but at the same time, what happens in New York starts to move from being, she starts to experience things not as a tourist, but as someone who is a New Yorker. And there's that moment of where she kind of realizes that she has to create roots here in New York, because she could actually go back and not find any place for her in that Shams. The volatility, I think the volatility of roots suddenly becomes quite apparent to her in New York. And that is why even the world of Sarah, which belongs to her, could be a model to learn from. But each person has to create their own steps in a way, because her experiences were very different from her aunt's. But it is the gender, I think what stayed with her, what made her also connected to her aunt, is not only, of course, the devotion and the love between them, but it's also that her aunt, after she became a Sufi, they said she became a man. And Noor is constantly, is confusing others about her gendered identity, about her voice, about her appearance. And it reaches a point where, a break point, of course, when she is in Connecticut, and the woman that is hosting her actually falls in love with her. So again, I think she also wants to resolve also her gender identity, and it becomes resolved in the US. So that's also very important. That for her aunt finds her way, she commits to that path because she's a believer. And she actually finds herself through that journey, through actually living in the US.
So, I mean, taking Noor, and you obviously use a lot of metaphors about light, the Shams and
Right.
Noor and Albat al-Daw.
Right.
Taking her and kind of giving her her moment of enlightenment, so to speak,
Yeah.
her personal moment of enlightenment.
Right.
That is a journey that a lot of immigrants seem to take. And I'm not talking about immigrants necessarily coming to the United States. Anytime we step from outside the boundaries of the familiar, and perhaps suffocatingly so, is a moment in which we have to rediscover who we are, because we don't have the usual routines, usual structures, usual relations
Right.
that are telling us who we are. So I'm using here immigrant in a very kind of loose sense, whether it's from the village to the city, or from Lebanon to the United States.
Right.
But at the same time, it seems, and this is where the contrast with Sarah struck me as very powerful, actually, almost it brought me to tears in some ways.
Really.
And I'm telling you, it's just beautiful writing.
Thank you so much.
And I'm always going to choke up thinking about it, but
Wow.
it's the notion that in the end, Sarah is grounded, but immigrants, we say they find themselves, but at the same time, at a cost of being, as we said earlier, liminal,
Right.
not belonging here, not belonging there,
Right.
almost rootless,
Right.
without any roots. I mean, which is this universal humanism that sets us afloat, free, but really at the same time, it's a freedom that comes at a price. Where Sarah's universal humanism is always anchored in the walnuts and this beef, that they ate, which I found to be
Right.
absolutely delightful scene, and the trees.
Yes.
So,
Very
as you can tell, this is
much.
why your book is so powerful. It actually moved.
Thank you.
So I'm kind of curious as
I
to.
cried many times when I was writing it.
Well, I'm not surprised, because it seems to me that there's part of you in that journey to
Yes,
be.
I think, yeah, definitely.
I mean, I don't want to be too ridiculously obvious, but I mean, obviously, you have your own journey of coming to America and doing that stuff.
Yes.
But I'm kind of curious about that ruthlessness, about how
Yeah.
do you see Noor ever resolving that? I mean, of belonging but not belonging, really, or is that a condition that we just have to live with, from that we cannot resolve?
I think that it is going to be painful, the idea that you leave the localized, even as a place. It's no longer like local. To that universal humanism, there is always a cost. In her case, the reason she sees it as a plus is because she feels it's allowing her to escape death. I mean, when it reaches a point when her brother wants her killed, that is, I think, when you become embedded in this other thing that, as you exactly said, is not clear. You're floating, but it's your way out. And I think I think it becomes, it will grow on you and you become attached to it just by that sense of survival, but just by that sense of survival. For others, like, me, I didn't have to escape any death. And I keep very profound ties with my family and with my siblings. Yes, that dislocation, that displacement, my son, Ziad, tells me, Mom, when you go out and stand on the deck, when I want to be alone, and I stand on the deck and I'm watching the snow, he said, I know you're thinking about Lebanon. I know. Like, even, without telling him. It's because it is those moments when I look out, beyond everything here, that yes, that's the place. Of course, that's the place. It is Lebanon. I don't think that this will ever change. And sometimes it's painful. It reaches a point where it's very painful, that sense of floatiness. But writing, I think creative writing, poetry and novels is cathartic that way, in the sense that each time you're trying to resolve it through the writing, it never gets resolved. It's like Sisyphus rock, you keep pushing it back. It never is. So tell me, Akram, maybe I would like to hear your thoughts. So so yeah, so it is. So you're talking about that sense where you leave that internal sense, or subconscious, where you're immersed very spontaneously in the patterns of life, earlier, and then later when you move to the US, and then you grow up here, uh, especially if you're moving in different directions, you get that sense of floatiness. Yeah.
You do, and I think it hit me when I was in my mid 20s. I think it's when
Right.
uh, it was a bit of a crisis of identity. But
Mm.
of course, I mean, I think the resolution, and I think you alluded to it a little bit, is that ultimately you have to embrace that liminality. That it's not a liability, but it's a strength that you have to turn into a strength that allows you to
Mm.
do that. Because in the end, as Lebanese immigrants, I think, of course, Noor is escaping a particular death, both an emotional death if she was to stay, but also
Right.
obviously the very real potential of physical death.
Yeah.
But I think many of us, of course, escape death in different ways. Civil war, economic death. I mean, a lot of us, our generation anyway, came here to escape a certain violence that was being visited.
Absolutely.
And I think the tension, which I really, again, I think you brought through in the novel, is that on one hand, the distance allows us to be nostalgic for a home, but you never allow the reader to get too nostalgic, because the reality is that that home A is full of problematic things and you don't shy away from difficult things, but also that that home has changed. It's no longer home in the sense that people move on, they have to live, and we're distant.
Exactly.
And we become strangers to a certain extent in our own places, even when we go back to village or town or city, in that sense. So, I mean, I think for me anyway, personally, that's why the novel was so powerful, is because it never shied away from the complexities of this whole condition of being an immigrant, and also the sense in which people look at us with puzzlement. They think, "Who are you when you come back?"
Exactly.
And sometimes they announce it in the way they say, "You're speaking Arabic with a bit of an American accent," although as a way of indicating to you that you don't quite belong anymore, which is really quite an interesting thing. So I mean, I think there are. That's why I think the book is very powerful. We don't have a whole lot more time, but I do want to
Mm.
ask you something that perhaps,
Yeah.
one of the things that I think is important is that for the Druze community in Lebanon, which is core to what Lebanon is historically and contemporaneously in many ways, I don't think there are many novels that actually address the community.
No, no, there are.
Uh, they are elided. They are completely elided from
Yes.
the literary scene almost. That I mean, as I was reading your novel, I kept trying to think, have I read about any character that is Druze in any major novel in Lebanon? And I
No.
couldn't remember any. I mean, I might be wrong, there might be some, but I didn't, nothing came to mind. So I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it's powerful in that sense, but that's not the only reason it's powerful.
But sure,
But I'm kind of curious as how do you think the community will take the writing?
yes, yes, that's such a good question. You know, Rabia Jaber wrote Druze Belgrade, but really the character there does not carry these local elements. So, you know, he could also be not Druze Belgrade, the character. The name says Druze. Iman Ahmeidan referred in a number of her novels a little bit to reincarnation. But again, it's nothing working through that community, putting the flesh on these people. And it was a very difficult task for me, honestly, because it is because there is also a way in which you want to simplify some of these characters and what they are saying. Like I remember my aunt, for instance, when my grandfather died, she said when she saw me, she said, I need to have a word with you. So I mean, there was always these kinds of advices, and I said, sure. She said, I heard that all of you were crying at the funeral of your grandfather. Someone told me, because he's my grandfather on my father's side, so she didn't attend the funeral. And I said, yes. She said, you know, this is really a terrible way of dealing with death. You know, we all belong to God. And this amount of crying for an old man is just simply, you are opposing God's will. You just sit there, you meditate, you think about something, but this kind of, she really was revolted by the fact that my siblings, you know, my siblings specifically, you know, were crying a lot at my grandfather's. She said, you know, look around you, look how many children had died during the Civil War. Have some perspective, you know, and also like in a way, what she wanted to say is that this is very egotistical. Like put yourself in the larger picture. He lived his life. He's an old man. So many kids are, and taslim, you know, you have to surrender to God. And I looked at her. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know. But I, of course, I understood exactly these teachings, part of the Druze teachings. Some of the pattern of that, the sense of it, I wanted to explain in the novel. The way they sit together, the way, you know, they kind of, when they see each other, they start to fight of who is going to kiss the hand of the other. You know, these things that, like, I watched these things, you know, since I was a child, and I was like, and I thought about them. I mean, they really deserve a film. I always thought, like, what are they doing? You know, what is going on here? And then my aunt said, well, you have to humble yourself first to the other person. You have to be the first to break your egotism. There's a lot of that idea of breaking the egotism, breaking yourself. Also, I mean, I remember vividly this scene where my aunt, my mother's, the sister of my grandmother, said, I have to go and make amends with a woman who is a very difficult woman, like very, very difficult woman, but they are both practitioners. So they are both Ajawid, so they actually practice the religion. And she said, I have to do it first. And I told her, so what will you do? She said, I will just go. I said, are you gonna say sorry? She said, I will have to. I said, but you hate this woman. Like basically that they fight. She said, it doesn't matter. I have to do it. So she went with my mother and she went in, and she was funny. So she went in the house, and I guess she couldn't say sorry. She just couldn't say sorry. So, but she just entered and sat in her living room. And this was kind of a minus. Like she should have apologized. So they keep working on these things, on the inability to actually scream at someone that you're upset with. And I don't know that this is ideal, but I do know that they feel that this is the way to train yourself to minimize your egotism. Some of these things really, I really liked about the Druze community. And then there are the others that I was deeply disturbed with. So,
Well, I have to say that regardless of whether you were writing critically or not so critically, I think in the end you make them human in a way that I have not seen. And I think, and actually I have to say, even village life, forget whether they're Druze or not. I mean, just that these characters come to life as human beings with all sorts of things. I mean, it's really interesting because the closest thing I could come close to seeing that is A Wedding in Galilee. I mean, the film of the Druze community in near the Haran region, and the characters and gender issues that played out. But I thought your characters, regardless, their flaws made them human, and you did a brilliant job bringing that across.
thank you so
Uh,
much.
Rula, I could go on for hours. Honestly, this has been
Sweet.
just an absolute delight to read your novel, to speak with you, and to catch this kind of passion and emotion and thought that you bring to this. So I want to thank you again
Thank
for taking
you
the time to be with us. And I want to say congratulations on winning the
so much.
2020 Khayrallah
Thank you.
Prize.
I'm really, really honored. Really honored. I really enjoyed this talk with you, Akram.
Well, we'll have to set up another time in which we can have another conversation because clearly there's a lot more to talk about here.
Certainly, it would be lovely.
All right. Well, listen, you take care of yourself and I will see you later. Yalla, ma
Bye bye. مع السلامة.